everyone, this is Des, and you are listening to the Wellness Project powered by Spotlight Coalition. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Avery Thatcher, formerly known as Heather Thatcher. Avery changed her first name to Avery in order to feel at home in her body again. Her given name at birth was Heather, but after such a significant loss of identity, she felt the need to release the past and start fresh. So she changed her name to Avery, and she finally felt at home in her body again and was finally able to start her healing process. Now, I'm really looking forward to speaking with Avery because I think a lot of people struggle with letting go of their past selves, grieving their past selves, and growing and changing into the newer version of yourself. I think this is going to be a really great conversation and one that I haven't had before. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from Avery. All right, let's speak with Avery about her transformation, changing her name, and grieving her past self. All right, everyone, I am here with Avery Thatcher, formerly known as Heather, which we are going to be talking about at length. So everyone help me welcome Avery. Avery, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Desiree. I am so excited.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to speaking with you today. So just to start out, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us your story?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I was originally born Heather, and I had been Heather for 37 years of my life. I was working in an ICU as a registered nurse, and I had been doing that for about a decade before I stepped away from that. But pretty much early on, I noticed that the majority of the reasons why adults found themselves in the ICU were because of illnesses and diseases that could be linked to chronic stress. So I decided to get out of the reactive side of medicine and into the proactive side of things. Started that back in 2015. And then at the end of 2018, it was Christmas morning. I was coming off the Christmas Eve night shift, just finished the shift. And then the charge nurse that I was reporting to for the day looked me in the eye and she was like, "Oh, Heather, you do not look well. I'm going to mark you down as sick for tonight. Just go home, have a rest, feel better." And I went home and I slept for 20 hours. And then I slept for 20 hours the next day and the day after that. Over the span of about 10 months and lots of painful tests, a really scary mass on my thyroid, a surgery, I eventually ended up with a chronic illness and a physically limiting disability that really changed everything for me. And so once I was diagnosed with that, I really struggled to figure out who am I now moving forward. And the pandemic hit. I had a lot of flare-ups of my PTSD. A lot of anxiety showed up for me out of nowhere. I would never identified as an anxious person before. And when I was telling the colleagues and friends that I knew that I've developed anxiety and OCD, they're like, "Really? Didn't see that coming." So it was just this huge culmination of things because with the pandemic, I was used to being in the ICU with SARS, with H1N1. I was working in the ICU. So who was I now? How do I navigate this different world? And eventually, and we can dig into this more, the moment and when things started to change for me. But I realized that I am not Heather. I'm not capable of being Heather anymore. So then I knew I had to really reassess and I needed a fresh start. So I went through a bunch of baby name blogs and the only name that jumped out at me was Avery. And once I decided to do that, and once I told my husband and my therapist, the PTSD dreams stopped. I felt at home in my body again. I felt like I could move forward with this life. And that was something which I had been struggling with for about 2 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That sounds like a really scary time. And can you share when your coworker said, "You're really not looking well, you should go home"? What kind of symptoms were going on? What was happening for you?
I looked like I hadn't slept in like a week. My dark circles were like past my cheeks. I had no energy. The brain fog was really thick as I was coming off that shift, which is kind of scary because in an ICU, you really need to be able to think on your toes and be adaptable. And that was not happening. So, really, it was that I had a lot of nausea. There was a lot of appetite issues. There was a whole pile of different things that all kind of showed up at once. And so this is why I think it took so long to get a really good, clear diagnosis, because I had three different things all show up at the same time. So I had a mass on my thyroid that had to get taken out. I had significant digestive issues that had to get sorted. And then I also had this chronic illness and disability that was underneath all of that, that all appeared at the same time.
Oh, yeah, that's extremely overwhelming. And then, so you just slept, you said, just for days at a time?
Yeah, I went from working full-time, 12-hour shift work, more than full-time, if we're being honest, and running a business on the side, this really high achieving person. I was very good at doing. And all of a sudden it just turned on a dime. And my energy is still severely limited today. And it's something that I've learned to work with. And since choosing to change my first name, it no longer feels like a fight because I don't have to become Heather anymore and go back
Right.
to the way that Heather was. I can just become Avery.
Right. So you feel like a completely different person than the person you used to be?
Very much so. And absolutely, there's still things that carry forward, but I feel more like myself now than I did 5 years ago.
That's amazing. And did you go through any sort of through this, transformational process? Did you go through any sort of grief for the person that you used to be, the person you let go?
Oh my goodness, yes. And looking back at it now, hindsight is kind of a jerk sometimes, but looking back at it now, I can see that I moved through the 5 stages of grief, just in a different order. And so I am a highly sensitive person, and I grew up with a significant amount of emotional trauma just throughout the way that it is growing up as a highly sensitive person in a very analytical world. It's just sort of a recipe for that kind of struggle. And so I really notice in the other people that I work with that identify as being highly sensitive, we process grief differently because anger is such a challenging emotion. It's an unsafe emotion. So we skip over anger, moving through the grief process, and then we get to this point of numb dissociation and we think that we're done, but we actually have to get angry. So I was actually leading a group through my Mindset Reboot program. And every time I lead a group through, I also do it. So I do all the work with them. I talk about what's coming up for me. So that way everybody knows that like, this is a maintenance process. And so I was there working through grieving the loss of Heather and deciding what to do. And this was before I had decided to change my name. And I was there just writing what I call my grief letter I was on the treadmill, just like writing a little letter there. We've got this little desk set up over it. And then I started writing the part of me that's sick. And I started writing, and the more I wrote, the angrier I got. And then I was just like, my fingers were flying on that keyboard. It was just so angry getting it all out, all of the loss that I had experienced over the last couple of years. And then it hit me like a wave that this part of me doesn't deserve anger, it deserves compassion. This is still a part of me that deserves love. And so then as I started to really embrace this illness, this change, this new me, I started to ugly cry, like holy smoke, whole body shaking. And I was down in a puddle on the floor. And it was just 2 years of grief released. It was from that moment that I could see the way out, to see that maybe I needed that fresh start. Maybe I needed to change my name. But if I didn't allow myself to get angry, we wouldn't be here having this conversation about this right now.
Right. I mean, all those different feelings are definitely valid. And I like how you talked about, moving through them and going beyond the anger. Grief is such a complex emotion and process. A lot of our listeners obviously have gone through grief in some capacity, but I really like how you talk about grieving the you that used to be, grieving your past self. So can you talk a little bit more about how you moved through that grief, how you processed it, and how you came to accept the new you?
Absolutely. So I was at this one like talking tunes kind of thing where people were doing spoken word and poetry and all the different things. And there's one woman did the most profound piece I've ever heard. And she said, grief is the last form of love you can give. And that just really shook me to my core. And when I look back at Heather, I can still love all that created me who I am now, and really just bring it all back to compassion as we move through that process. Compassion is something really that's been trained out of us, especially as women. We are so compassionate to other people, but we wouldn't hold the door open for ourselves. We wouldn't give ourselves the seat on the bus. We just don't have that degree of compassion. So, one of the things that I was starting to do prior to that with my clients and students was self compassion scripts, and they were absolutely essential to my healing. Because when it's been trained out of us so much, we have to come at it from a more analytical way in order to create the habit again. So, a self compassion script has three pieces: it validates the experience, it offers comfort, and then it gives you a plan. And so, one of the most clear examples of when I used a self compassion script was when this huge mass on my thyroid was discovered. It was about 3 inches, and it had grown that way over the course of about 4 months. And so it just kept growing. They didn't know what it was. We didn't know if it was cancer. And so I went for a test, a biopsy, where the doctor is there pushing this gigantic needle into my neck multiple times to get samples from different areas. And it was incredibly scary. It was painful. And being a nurse, I know what they're looking for. So that also just added a new layer of anxiety on top of that. And so while this was happening, I was saying to myself, it's okay to be scared. You don't know what these results are going to say. You don't know what's going to happen after that. But you can breathe through this. You have survived 100% of the things you've done before. You have support with your husband. You can figure this out. So you can make it through one more breath. And this next breath, just keep breathing. You can do this. And I would just keep repeating that to myself over and over again. And before I knew it, the test was over and I was up and about and on my way. And without that self-compassion script, I could have spiraled quite a bit into worrying about things. So as I now have moments that still trigger that grief of the loss of who I was, a self-compassion script is really perfect for holding space for those emotions without pushing them down, but also just coming up with that plan, giving myself guidance for how to move through.
Oh, I love that because I think it's so important to validate our own feelings. And like you said, be self-compassionate because so often, and like you said, we're almost trained to by our society, we're taught to like push our emotions down, stuff them down. And when we do that, and so many people do that, and I'm guilty of that as well, our feelings, they're there and they're powerful and they'll manifest in all these different unhealthy ways. So I love that tip. That's really great.
It made a huge difference for me. So I really hope it helps somebody listening.
Oh, definitely. Now, I would love to hear about what even gave you the idea to change your name. How did that thought occur to you? I would love to hear more about that.
It was actually a video on TikTok. So I was just dissociating kind of and scrolling through TikTok and just trying to disconnect from the struggle. And then this video popped through of this person, and they were describing their thought about why shouldn't we be able to have a chosen name? So you're given a birth name and then you live your life with that name until a certain point. And then once you learn more about who you are and who you're not, you choose a name. And then there's another celebration for your chosen name. And then I was like, that's interesting. Because I never really felt like a Heather. I never connected to that name truly. And when I shared that I wanted to change my name, a lot of my really close friends were saying, I never really saw you as a Heather anyway. It was really that video. And then just knowing that something has to change because I can't keep living anchored to this past version of me. I have to be able to move forward.
That is so interesting. And that's really interesting that you said your friends never saw you as a Heather anyway. That's really interesting. I was going to ask you what your friends, family, loved ones, what was their reaction when you said that you were changing your name?
It went a lot better than I expected. And I didn't expect anybody to be rude. I just expected people to maybe sit in their own discomfort of the idea and not be really knowing how to process that. But when I told my husband, and really explained what was going on, he said that like it scares him because it's weird and it's different and he doesn't know anybody that's done that. But he said, if this is what I want, then he's behind me 100% of the way. And then when I told my family, I told them in stages. So I told my parents first, and oh boy, I was shaking like a leaf at the table, like the nerves in my voice. I don't think I've ever heard myself that nervous. I remember my dad was just sort of staring off and deep breathing as I was telling him. And I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. But they just embraced the idea and they said, you know what, it's going to take a little bit of time because we've known you as Heather for 37 years, but we'll make it work. And then I told my siblings and they were all very supportive. I told my in-laws, incredibly supportive. And the thing that I think worried me the most, because I knew that I was going to change my name regardless of what my family and friends had thought, what worried me the most was the process, because my previous brand was Heather Thatcher. Everything was Heather Thatcher. My website, my social media handles, all of the articles that I've written, everything was all branded Heather Thatcher. And I was like, oh, it's going to be so much work. But just breaking it down piece by piece and realizing that that was really where the fear was coming from me, because there's three core fears and one of them is fear of the process. And so by identifying that, it helped me really acknowledge it and then like hold that fear and move forward anyway.
Right. Yeah. I really wanted to hear what his reaction was. So I'm so glad that he was so supportive and that you had so many supportive people in your life. That's really amazing. And yeah, it's kind of different, but kind of funny. I know you're married, but I'm not married, but my sister just got married and she's been just texting me off the hook of what an ordeal it is to change her name on everything. So, and she doesn't have a website or a big following or anything like that on social media. So I can only imagine that, as well. So it is, I mean, it's a big process. Does anybody to this day, do they accidentally call you Heather, or is everybody has Avery down?
The majority of people have Avery down. Yeah,
Okay,
there's still
great.
just a couple of people that are struggling with the transition, but I know that they're not saying it out of a place of malice. And what's really touched me is that some of the areas online, like different people that I've collaborated with when I've done like a testimonial video for them or something, or written a piece of content for them, almost all of them have changed my name for me without me asking. They've re-edited videos, they've re-edited their blog posts, all to reflect the name change. And that has just been so overwhelmingly beautiful for me to see.
Oh, yeah, that's really, really amazing. So, with this name change, did your healing process come before the name change or after?
So I think the moment that I talked about on the treadmill, that created the space to start the healing journey. Because prior to that, I was still really fighting it, just trying to figure out, okay, how can I make things work to go back to the way I were before? But it was after the name change that the momentum really started. That's where I felt no longer anchored by the past and really just free to explore what life looks like now. So I think the name change was absolutely the catalyst.
Okay, great. And I know a lot of people were just wired to resist change as human beings. A lot of people resist that change. Do you have any tips at all for anybody going through a change, resisting that change and, trying to anchor on to the past? Do you have any good tips for people?
So I actually have a story. So there's an old Taoist story that talks about this farmer. And this farmer has a bunch of horses that help plow the fields and maintain the land. And his neighbors came up to him and they're like, oh, you're so lucky. You have all of these horses. Like, that's such a blessing. And he says, maybe. The next day, his strongest horse runs away. And then all of his neighbors come and they're like, oh, that's such terrible luck. I'm so sorry that happened. How terrible did that happen to you? And he said, maybe. The next day, the horse comes back bringing three more wild horses with him. And the neighbors are all like, oh my gosh, how lucky. They brought back three more horses. You have so many horses now. You must be so happy. And he said, maybe. The next day, his son was trying to break in some of the horses so that they could use them on the farm, and he fell off and broke his leg. And his neighbors came to him and they're like, oh, that's so unlucky that your son broke his leg. That's terrible. And he said, maybe. The day after that, the Imperial Guard comes by to recruit every able-bodied young man to come and fight in a war. And his neighbors come up to him and say, how lucky was it that your son had his leg broken? Because then he didn't have to go off to fight. The farmer said, maybe. So really, we don't know if the change that's coming is going to be good luck, bad luck, positive, negative. We have no idea. And really, change is going to happen anyways. The more that we learn to really just go with the flow and be curious, that's really the thing that's made the biggest difference for me all across my life, is just to really embrace that radical curiosity, to not see something as good or bad, but just be like, oh, I wonder where this goes.
Oh, I haven't heard that story. I love that. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you for sharing that story. That's really great.
You're welcome. It's had such a huge impact on me, and everybody that I tell it to is like, oh, I get it.
Oh, yeah. It's such a good mindset to be in for sure. Because, like you said, we never know when things happen, how they're going to impact our lives at all. So, that's a
Mhm.
really great mindset.
And I know that it's harder in some cases to embrace that curiosity. And especially, like, unfortunately, this chronic illness and disability, it was not the first time or even the fifth time that life had thrown something challenging my way like this, even health wise. Really, it's just saying, like, okay, and now what? And just making the most of whatever comes next. I've lived there in that space of fear, waiting for the next shoe to drop. There was a time just before I changed my name where I was like, hey, it's been about 2 years. It seems to be about the time in between when bad stuff happens to me. So what's coming? And I was living from this place of fear. And it was when I really embraced that curiosity that everything started to change. And instead of having this fear, I was just ready to embrace whatever adventure came my way, good or bad.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because it's really hard to get past that fear. And I think, especially now with just social media and everything, everything's just at the tip of our fingers at all times. So I think it's so easy to live in that fear. And it feels like this kind of doom and gloom in our society right now. So I really like how you explained that.
I agree that there is so much doom and gloom in our society right now. And so, one of the top stress management tips that I give is to be careful of what you consume, both physically and what you bring in nutritionally, but then also what do you look at on a daily basis? The accounts that you follow on social media, are they actually serving you or are they sabotaging you? Because what we surround ourselves with starts to shape our perspective. So just being really conscious of how you are shaping your own perspective.
Oh, yes, I fully agree. I know you're on TikTok. I love TikTok. And I feel like a lot of the accounts that I follow, they're very uplifting and very motivational. And there's a lot of, animal stories and rescue stories and things like that. But I know there's just on social media, there's a very dark side and people get really sucked into that. And it can be really hard with the algorithms when you're watching certain content on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. It kind of caters to that. So what you consume, I mean, that's what they're going to be feeding you. So it could be really hard to get out of that. So just being mindful of what you're watching and that the algorithm is going to cater that kind of content to you. So just to be careful in that way as well.
Absolutely. Sometimes what I recommend you do, and I have this as well, is I'll have a second account that is for more news type stuff. But then I have another one that is truly just for fun. So if I see like a news post that comes by, I'll share it to my other account and look at it at another time. But otherwise, the accounts that I go on for enjoyment and for inspiration, I make sure that I protect those spaces.
Oh, I love that. That is a great tip. Thanks for sharing that. That's a really good idea.
No, you're welcome.
So, I want to talk a little bit about. I know you said that when you changed your name to Avery, you felt really at home in your body. Was there any sort of process that you went through to accept the new version of you, or did it just kind of feel like you sat in it and it was just that was it?
Great question. So initially, I felt like, oh, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders just by choosing to change my name to start fresh. But then the more and more that I've been living as Avery, the more that I continue to grow into who I really need to be and who I really want to be. And so I think a lot of the practices that have worked really well for me are really what I teach. So, really, yoga, the full 8 limbs of yoga, not just the Western get fit yoga, to really look at it from that philosophical space, doing a lot of trauma work for myself, just to really move through some things and then to choose to show up unapologetically myself. And so initially, when I did that, there was a lot of fear to be like, if you put yourself out there and somebody doesn't treat you well, that it's just going to like be just like before. But the truth is I am much different than I was when I was a child. If somebody treats me in a way that I'm not happy with, as an adult, I can say, okay, we're done. So it's just really reconnecting that even though the fear is still in your body because it's what you have learned up until this point, realizing that you are a lot different than when that fear based programming started. And so just really connecting back to that was also a really helpful piece for me. And then the last piece was choosing to be vulnerable. That scared the pants off of me initially. Like the idea of coming on and sharing this kind of story with someone just never would have happened with Heather. 100% no, because I didn't know how to trust. And really, what it came down to was not learning how to trust other people, but how to trust myself. That journey of learning how to regain that trust with myself, I think, has had a huge impact on that acceptance process as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, being vulnerable is so, so difficult for people. Do you have any tips for those that really struggle with being vulnerable?
Yeah. So I recommend that you start with somebody that you know is safe. And then you start off by saying, this is really hard for me to share, but I'm going to be sharing this with you. And so I need you to help hold space for this. And so with my illness, I struggled to even be vulnerable with my husband. We'd been together for like 9 years before I got sick, but we'd only been married for about 4 months. For the first little bit, he could know when my appointments were, but couldn't come. And then he was allowed to come and drive me there, but wait in the parking lot. And then eventually he was allowed to come into the building, eventually into the waiting room, and finally into the office. And so I just told him the feelings that were happening for me. So I let the loved ones know what was going on and why I was keeping them at arm's length, and really just asking for patience. And so as you're learning to be vulnerable, take it in little steps and take it with somebody that you trust.
I love that. I love those little baby steps and building up to it. That's a really, really great tip. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, Avery, this has been so amazing speaking with you and you sharing your story with all of us. What advice you have for those that are kind of looking for a fresh start? Maybe they are ready to change their name, maybe they're not ready. Any tips that you have for those that just kind of want to let go of the past and more look towards the future?
So I think journaling is something that I'd recommend you start, because if you're really not connecting with who you are, getting it out on paper or digitally, if you're a digital journaler like I am, to really just dive into those feelings in a safe way is an excellent starting point. And then from there, I would recommend speaking to a coach, a therapist, somebody that can help you navigate as you go through, because our inner protective mechanisms are going to be ringing the alarm bells all over the place and ramping up our stress response as we go through this if you don't know how to manage those kinds of experiences. And so that's something that a therapist or a counselor can help navigate.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that is a really great tip. Well, Avery, thank you so much for being here today. Can you please tell everyone where they can go and find you?
Thank you so much for asking. That's really sweet. So they can find me on Instagram. That's my most active platform, at Becoming Avery. I am on all social media platforms with that handle. And then you can also find me at my website, becomingavery.com.
Great. Everyone, go check out Avery. I'm going to have all of her links in the show notes. Avery, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for holding space for this. I really appreciate it.
Avery, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Everyone, go check out Avery. All of her links are in the show notes. I loved hearing Avery's story, and I loved hearing that idea of giving yourself a name. And not a lot of people know this. Some people in my life know this, but I wasn't given a middle name when I was born. So my name is just Desiree Argentina. But in high school, maybe it was middle school, I was very jealous that everybody had a middle name and I didn't. So I gave myself a middle name. And at that time, there was some Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen show on TV. I can't even remember what it was, but one of the characters was named Riley, and I loved that name. So I told everybody that my middle name was Riley. And so my name was then Desiree Riley Argentina. And I started writing Riley on everything, every paper, every document, And I don't know how this happened because I don't think I wrote it at the DMV, but I actually got my driver's license and it said Desiree R, Argentina. And that's when I freaked out and I let go of the Riley middle name. So then I had to rewrite everything without that initial. And I don't know, it freaked me out. I thought I was going to get in trouble with the government. I don't know, but kind of funny. But I had that thought in middle school or high school that I really wanted to have a middle name. So I gave myself one. So I already love that idea of giving yourself a name. I don't think it's ever a bad thing to reinvent yourself, especially if you feel a major loss of identity like Avery did and letting go that past self. And I really appreciate her tips on how to grieve that past self and how to accept the new version of us. We're always growing, we're always changing. And I think after some time, especially a traumatic event or going through a big medical issue like Avery did, I think sometimes we look back and we don't even recognize ourselves anymore. So I love that idea of giving yourself a new identity and stepping into your newer version of yourself. So thank you, Avery, so much for sharing your story. All right, everyone, I will see you next week with another amazing guest. I hope you make it a great week.